At the recently concluded COP29 of UNFCCC, a decision was taken to ensure full operationalization of loss and damage fund. And with this, the fund can start financing the projects starting from 2025. So today, let's try to understand what is this concept of loss and damage fund. In this context, a good starting point can be the 6th assessment report of IPCC. And the 6th assessment report of IPCC, if we check what it observes, the first thing that is, it acknowledges the fact that human-caused climate change is already affecting many weather and climate extremes. Along with that, what it observes is vulnerable communities who have historically contributed the least to current climate change are disproportionately affected. In the continuance, it observes 3.3 to 3.6 billion people are highly vulnerable, and along with that, people with considerable development constraints have high vulnerability, which means it is trying to link the developmental constraints or development status with the vulnerability aspect. And along with that, what we see is the adverse impacts of and related losses and damages are unequally distributed across the system. So now, based on this, if we try to understand this concept of loss and damage, what I see is first the developed nations. Now, developed nations or industrialized nations, they have been historically responsible for the emissions, and so they can be considered to be historical contributors to present day problem of climate change. On the other hand, when I talk about the less developed nations, so less developed nations, they are facing the brunt of this problem, okay, in the form of droughts, floods, or increased frequency of disasters such as cyclones. So already they are facing the issue, and on the top of that, what I see is the money, where these countries do not even have the money or the fund to tackle the problem. So this is the underlying problem, where the less developed countries do not have the resources to deal with the crisis situation that has emerged due to the climate change. So that's the vulnerability we are talking about. So what's the way out now? The idea is the historical contributors to the problem, the developed nations, should compensate the developing countries for the losses and damages that they are incurring right now. And this compensation now comes in the form of loss and damage fund. So what's the idea of loss and damage fund? The idea is that the less developed countries, okay, with the limited financial resources or any other such type of resource, including technical expertise, are not able to cope up with the adverse impacts of climate change. And so they should be assisted, they should be compensated. Assisted or compensated by whom? By them or by those who have been historical contributors to the present day problem. So that's the idea of loss and damage fund. So with this, now it would be noteworthy to see the timeline, okay, the historical timeline through which the concept has developed. So all in all, it starts in 1991. In 1991, when Association of Small Island States, AOSIS, now it presents a demand to evolve a mechanism for compensation to these countries to deal with the problem associated with sea level rise or climate change in general. Next year itself, in 1992, when United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was signed. Now, this convention, although acknowledges this problem, but yet there was no explicit mention or inclusion of this concept in the convention. Then way later, in 2010, Cancun Agreement, COP16. This Cancun Agreement is where this concept of loss and damage was officially adopted. So loss and damage concept was officially adopted in Cancun Agreement. Then comes up 2013. And in 2013, okay, the Warsaw International Mechanism, WIM, was established. Now this Warsaw International Mechanism was related to this whole idea that was adopted in 2010, that is loss and damage. Okay, we'll talk about this, okay, in a while, but as of now, Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage, 2013. Then came the historical aspect of Paris Agreement. in 2015. Now, what about Paris Agreement? In Paris Agreement, under Article 8, very explicitly loss and damage concept was acknowledged, as well as was acknowledged what should be the role of WIM in this respect. Then later in 2019, Santiago network was established. Now Santiago network was the extension of WIM, okay, which was related to the technical aspect of WIM. Again, we will talk about that just after this. And lastly, that is in 2022 at COP27, okay, this was the COP where loss and damage fund was established. So loss and damage fund was established when? In 2022 at COP27 held in Egypt. So this is roughly the timeline in the context of development of the concept of loss and damage. Now from here, if we talk about these mechanisms, the earlier mechanisms that we have been dealing with, okay, the first one, that is Warsaw International Mechanism. So Warsaw International Mechanism, we have seen that it was established in 2013. And overall, if we see Warsaw International Mechanism, WIM, I can identify roughly 3 components of this mechanism. What are the 3 components? So the 3 components, the first component was related to enhancing knowledge. Enhancing knowledge and our understanding regarding what? Regarding this crisis management. That when this is the crisis related to climate change, how can we manage it? That was the first idea, developing the knowledge, enhancing the knowledge. Apart from that, second aspect is strengthening the cooperation. Strengthening the cooperation and dialogue between whom? Between different concerned parties. And which are the concerned parties here? On one hand, you have the developed countries. On another hand, you have less developed countries. So ensuring and strengthening dialogue and cooperation between them, that had been the second element of the WIM. And the third one had been to secure and mobilize. So secure and mobilize what? Secure and mobilize, okay, the first thing, that is finance. Apart from finance, technology needed to deal with loss and damages. And the third one, that is capacity building. So we can see that WIM in this context is a very comprehensive mechanism to deal with whole of the idea of loss and damage. After this, the next comes is the Santiago network. So Santiago network now deals with the technical aspect, which means the technology, the technical expertise that is required to deal with or cope up with this loss and damage, climate induced loss and damage. For that, Santiago network was established. And what it do is primarily it connects the affected countries, the vulnerable countries, with the technical expertise, technical experts. And so it provides technical expertise to them. Now in this case, if you see over here under WIM, also we had this element, that is technology. So effectively what has happened is this Santiago network was established to ensure this only, which means the Santiago network is not a standalone arrangement, but rather it was the extension of WIM only. In fact, the Santiago network works under the guidance of WIM. So it is a technical arm of WIM. So these have been the earlier arrangements. Now from here, when we talk about Article 8 of what? We have seen earlier the Paris Agreement. So let's see what Paris Agreement talks about. So Article 8 of Paris Agreement, initially if you see what it reads, parties recognize the importance of averting, minimizing and addressing loss and damage associated with adverse effects of climate change, which includes extreme weather events as well as slow onset events, both included. But the idea in the first point is that yes, Paris Agreement acknowledged this whole idea. Secondly, if you see, it recognizes WIM, and along with this it says that WIM shall be subject to the authority and guidance of Conference of Parties, which means now that WIM works under the overall mechanism of Paris Agreement or UNFCCC. And Likewise, over here, it says what has to be done. So parties should enhance understanding, action and support, including through WIM mechanism, the cooperative and facilitative basis. So this is where you see that in Article 8 of Paris Agreement, very explicitly has been mentioned this whole concept. Now, the idea is when we talk about this fund, the loss and damage fund, what would be the primary sources of the funds or funding for loss and damage fund? So although as of now nothing has been finalized, but yet if we see the most probable of the three streams of funding, what I find first can be the voluntary contributions. Voluntary contributions from whom? Voluntary contributions from the developed nations. So developed nations, we have already established this concept earlier, that developed nations, okay, historical contributors to present day problem. So they are supposed to help the developing countries, and that's from where the voluntary contributions from developed countries will come. As of now, it's the most important source of funding, okay, for this fund. But along with that, few other sources of funding also has been proposed, like say for example the one which has been called as the innovative funding. Now innovative funding would include what? Innovative funding would include, let's say for example, the taxes and levies on carbon intensive industries like maritime industry, aviation industry. We can impose taxes on them. Okay, similarly, transaction charges and levies can be imposed on fossil fuel extraction activities. So all of these can be under the innovative funding source. Although it remains there, the taxes, the levies, okay, but yet this type of, or this source of funding has been vehemently opposed by the developed countries. Of course, because it involves taxations, taxing these industries. And the third source of funding can be the linkage with existing mechanisms. Now, linkage with existing mechanisms, what would be these mechanisms? So, with respect to financing, we already have some existing mechanisms. Like what? Take for example, Global Environment Facility. Take for example, Green Climate Fund. Okay, these mechanisms are already involved in financing the climate change related projects. And so, most possibly, the loss and damage fund can link with them, and so it can also become a source of funding for this fund. So these are the three possible sources of funding. So the concept is there, the source of funding is there, but now the question is, what would be the challenges that this fund may face? So the challenges, when we are talking about challenges, the first challenge of course would be the adequacy of fund. So adequacy of fund, the idea is when there is widespread impact that we are witnessing of the climate change across the world, and there are so many vulnerable countries, the question is how much money would be needed to deal with or tackle this issue of loss and damage. Very obviously it would be a huge quantum, and so a pertinent question is whether we will be able to create, okay, that large of fund which can meet the demand of everyone across the world. So adequacy of fund is a question. Apart from that, the sustainability. So sustainability of the fund or funding is again a question. Because take for instance, when we talk about the funding sources or funding streams, voluntary contribution, okay, which is the major chunk right now. Voluntary contribution, the question would be whether this contribution would be one time or whether it would be recurring. Okay, if it has to be recurring, who would ensure that? And if it is not recurring, how come your funding would be sustainable? From where this funding will keep coming? From where the money will keep flowing? Of course, one solution that has been proposed is innovative funding, because it involves taxation, okay, taxing the industries, which will keep the money flowing into the fund. But as I have told you, it has been opposed right now by the developed nations. So the sustainability of funding right now is in question. Then along with that, the operational aspect. When you say operational aspect, once the funds start funding the project, okay, the question would be okay, how it will operate. Similarly, who would be eligible for that? So if you see, as of now, the eligibility criteria have not been finalized. So what would be the eligibility criteria? How it would be operational? All of that is still to be seen, and still a consensus has to be reached on that. So operational challenges. Okay, apart from that, access. Access now, where the funds have been created for vulnerable countries, correct? And so the underlying idea is those who are in the need, they should get the fund, they should get the access to the fund. So equitable access to the fund. But in general, we have seen that there are a lot of bureaucratic and governance hurdles that do not allow these less developed countries, least developed countries to get access to any of these type of funds that are created. So that is something that has to be ensured. And lastly, the coordination. With respect to coordination, what we see already, there are mechanisms. There is WIM, there is Santiago network, and now there is a separate fund, that is loss and damage fund. And we have to understand, we have to keep in mind, loss and damage fund is entirely independent of the WIM. So in this context, how we would be able to find convergence between these different mechanisms, how the coordination between them would be ensured, that again would be a question. So overall, if we see, these are the challenges, and this is the idea of the loss and damage fund. So till here, as of now, almost more than $730 million are there in the fund. But again, if you see this $730 million, the question again pops up, that is the adequacy of the fund. This definitely is not anywhere near to what would be actually required. So as of now, the challenges are there, but yet if we see, the operationalization of the fund itself is a big step, and let's hope that in the future we are able to fully capitalize on it, and it starts generating the benefits for the most vulnerable countries across the world.